Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one involves a topic that I'm often asked about, but I actually don't lecture on much, simply because we don't have a lot of evidence for it. We don't have a good way to test it. We don't even have a good definition for it. And that topic is intelligence. When I was doing work with animal language research, working with dolphins, people always, well, how smart are dolphins? And it depends on how you look at it. It depends on what you mean by smart. Usually by smart, when we're talking animals, we mean how similar are they to human beings. Because we think if you act like a human being, you must be smart. Although, quite frankly, there's a lot of things that humans do I don't think are particularly smart, but that's a whole nother lecture. But when it comes to the topic of intelligence, it's one of those things that everybody kind of knows what it is, but when you're asked to put it into words, it can be very, very difficult. And this is true not only of the general public, but it's also true of a lot of psychologists, and it may well be true of a lot of researchers in intelligence. So we have an awful lot of questions which tend to boil down into two broad categories. The first is, what is it? What do we mean by intelligent? What are we talking about when we say someone is intelligent? And so then you say, well, it means that you're smart. And what does smart mean? And people say, well, it's you're intelligent. You either get circular, or you say you're intelligent because you do well in school, but there's lots of ways to do well in school. Some people don't have to study at all. Some people study hard. Are they both equally intelligent if they get the same results? Well, no. Well, then what do you mean? It's really difficult. So psychologists have been trying to pin this down for a while. The first really sort of scientific attempt to pin this down was done about 100 years ago, and it was through what's called an intelligence quotient, or an IQ. You've probably heard somebody say, well, I have a high IQ, or give you a number that they say that their IQ is. The idea is that this is a number that's based around 100. 100 is average, and 140 is gifted, and varying amounts below, I think below 85 is considered impaired. And I mean, there's all sorts of quantifications that go on with these numbers that may or may not be accurate. Now, the way that IQ works is an individual's abilities are tested, and then those abilities are compared to the abilities of the average person of that age. This is much easier to do with children than it is in adults. Once you hit adulthood, researchers really stop talking about IQ, because with children it's easy. You could say, well, 5-year-olds should be able to do this, and 8-year-olds should be able to do that, and there's probably a wide gap in there. But is there as wide a gap between, say, a 30-year-old and a 33-year-old? Not really. So it's difficult to really measure IQ in adults. Now, researchers have gotten around this by saying, well, the IQ that you have as a child may indeed carry over to your IQ as an adult, but we can't know this for sure. We can't. We don't even know, IQ can depend on what it is that you're testing. Are you testing cognitive? Are you testing abstract reasoning? Are you testing spatial relationships? Can you put the round peg in the round hole? There's all sorts of things that can be tested here. How do you test a child, for instance, who is too young to read or write? You have to do things verbally. Well, you have to depend, maybe they haven't been exposed to language well enough to be really good verbally, and therefore they may be at a disadvantage, even though their intelligence, whatever it is, may be the same as a child who's had all of the good things and been read to and everything. It's so difficult to try to compare people in terms of this. And it's also very difficult to carry this on into the modern age, because this was devised 100 years ago or so. We know a lot more right now, for instance, about how the brain works, about how the brain develops. We know more about how memory works, how we put things into the various stages of memory and how we pull them out. We know more about how we think, cognition, how we acquire and retain knowledge. We know more about how we problem solve. We know more about lots of things. And the IQ hasn't necessarily kept up with it. And it also seems very, very limiting. It's really only testing one aspect, which is cognition, which is thinking and acquiring knowledge. And a lot of us tend to get over-focused on that. Probably because in school, that's what we get tested on. And in school, people say, well, this person is smart because they get all A's. Well, currently researchers have been saying, no. The intelligence quotient is good for what it is, but it's limited, because it doesn't really cover the whole spectrum of what could be included in intelligence. For instance, and I realize this isn't the best source, but I give you Wikipedia, where it says that human intelligence can be defined as, and I quote, abstract thought, understanding, self-awareness, communication, reasoning, learning, emotional knowledge, retaining knowledge, planning, and problem solving. That runs the gamut. And there are some researchers now that have come up with ways for test intelligence that include all of those. If you've ever heard the term emotional intelligence, for instance, that was a big buzzword there for a while and may still be. That's when we start talking about things like multiple intelligences. And a researcher named Gardner came up with all sorts of different categories of intelligences, many of which were part of that list that I just read you. Emotional intelligence, cognitive intelligence, spatial intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, and which of course leads us to all sorts of new problems. Because what both the intelligence quotient and multiple intelligence have in common and have as a problem is how do we measure these? Like I was talking before, how do you measure intelligence in a child who may not be able to read and write or may not be able to speak well? Or how do you compare children? Is there such a thing as a native intelligence? How do you compare a child, for instance, that's trying to get into, or an adult, that's trying to get into college and they've been able to afford SAT tutors and they've been able to afford ACT tutors and they've been able to afford extra help versus a child that may not be going to the best high school to begin with and can't afford all of those things? Does that mean that the child with all the advantages or the adult with all the advantages is smarter than the adult that doesn't? Well, no, but how then do you measure this intelligence? How do you measure intelligence across cultures? How do you measure intelligence in people who may not speak English, for instance? How do you come up with a test that you can give everybody? Remember, the whole point of tests is that they should work for pretty much everybody. It's sort of like variables. You want to keep the test constant so you can see that differences may be due to intelligence or that sort of thing. Well, when you translate things from one language to another, you could introduce problems. Even comparing things from one culture to another. Early on in the study of intelligence, in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of people who were testing intelligences were not necessarily doing so in schools, although granted there was a lot of that going on fairly early, but they were doing it, for instance, to try to determine which immigrants should be allowed in the country. Because, of course, they didn't want to let the dumb ones in. They only wanted to let the ones in that would be an advantage, that would be a good thing for the country. So they gave them intelligence tests. And there were huge amounts of abuses here. Because, for instance, in some extreme cases, they would have people come in and need to take an intelligence test, but they didn't have any tests in that language, or they didn't have anybody who spoke that language to explain it, to let them know what's going on. And if you have someone that's illiterate, you need somebody who's working there who can speak it. Otherwise, they're going to look pretty stupid. Or they used cultural questions. That's another thing about intelligence tests, is that we tend to assume that if we know something, that everyone should know it, that if we know it, it should be important. Thomas Edison once famously came up with what he thought that every American adult should know. And one of them was something like, calculate the weight of the air in a room of these dimensions. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I could do that. But Thomas Edison thought that everyone should be able to do that. Okay? I once was hanging out with a small child who was astonished by the fact that I did not know all of the different Pokemon. Pokemon was a fad back in the 90s and early 2000s, a Japanese animated series, and there were dozens of these Pokemon, and I didn't really know any of them, and she was stunned. She could not believe how stupid I was because I didn't know these Pokemon. I had a PhD in psychology at the time, but because I didn't know Pokemon, I was stupid. I mean, you start running into all of these things, and they're all problems in terms of how do you measure intelligence, and what is intelligence? Like I said, if you get tutoring, does that make you more intelligent? It might make you do better in class. You know, are we born with a certain amount of intelligence? Does that intelligence stay the same? It's just that some people tap into it and others don't? Or the amount that the environment plays into intelligence is so large that, like I said, until we get some of these questions answered. Now, I'm a psychologist. I'm pretty good with unanswered, vague questions. Because a lot in psychology we don't have good answers for. And we just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, it's a mystery, maybe we'll know sometime. But something like intelligence is used so commonly. and is used to affect people's lives and change people's lives, that when I see the possibility of intelligence being misused or misinterpreted, it makes me very uncomfortable. So the next time someone starts talking about intelligence, you may want to confirm with them exactly what it is they mean, how they test it, how they make sure that their ideas are valid before you start buying everything that they say, including me.